So, good evening, everybody. Thank you to everyone for being here tonight. This is a very special evening for Tree with Roots, and it's my name is Neil, and it's a pleasure to convene this gathering tonight. Let me say a few words of introduction. I'm in Natick, Massachusetts, and this is my online platform for Jewish learning that we created 6 years ago. As a matter of fact, next week is our 6 year anniversary because our first event was a Hanukkah program in the winter of 2019. That is 4 months before the pandemic arrived and everything switched over to online learning. It's the first and last time I think I was ever ahead of a curve on anything. And since that time, this platform has just grown bigger and bigger. And I'm really gratified and grateful to all of you who keep coming back. And I'm grateful to those of you who are here for the first time tonight. Welcome, one and all. We have classes that run perpetually. We have weekly Torah class and classes that unfold in multiple parts. We have special events, stuff around holidays. And one of the great pleasures of this platform is bringing in Jewish authors and Jewish thought leaders, like the teacher who brings us together tonight. It is a great pleasure to reintroduce Scott Seligman to our Tree with Roots community. Scott is an award-winning writer and historian with a special interest in the history of hyphenated Americans. He's a former corporate executive who holds a BA in American history from Princeton and master's from Harvard, and he writes books that occupy, I think, a very important place in our history and our consciousness. All of his books are impeccably researched, but they are also told from the perspective of a fabulous storyteller who has an important story to share. Let me tell you about them very quickly. The first book of Jewish American interest was, I got a whole Seligman section on my bookshelf, you should know. The first was The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, which was a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Awards, and tells the story of political and religious corruption, and also the tale of 3,000 Jewish women on New York's Lower East Side who came together and organized, fed up with the price gouging that drove up the price of meat at the turn of the century. His second book on these themes, brought him to a Tree with Roots in 2024, and he came to teach us about the Chief Rabbi's Funeral, which tells the story of the first and failed attempt to create a Chief Rabbi of America, and also America's largest anti-Semitic riot when thugs attacked the funeral procession on the streets of New York. Tonight, Scott is here to discuss his new book, The Great Christmas Boycott of 1906. And I have to tell you, I enjoyed this book immensely, in part because freedom of religion and the civil liberties embedded in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights have long been a personal passion of mine. The book tells the story of the struggle over the place of religion in the public schools. It starts in turn of the 20th century New York, in the downtown communities of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who are confronted with Christmas pageants in their public schools, and teachers and principals who urged the children to be more like Jesus. And it culminates with a story of community organizing, a school walkout, an anti-Semitic backlash, accusations of waging a war on Christmas, and so on. And these events from 120 years ago have a ripple effect through a century's worth of struggles for civil liberties and wrestling with the place of religion in public life, something we still wrestle with today. And I have to say, at this particular moment, at our moment of surging anti-Semitism, the worst that it's ever been in most of our lifetimes, there are such compelling and important lessons to be learned from our history from stories like this. And we are so blessed to have historians like Scott to teach us about that history. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Scott Seligman, the pride of Weequahic High School of Newark, New Jersey, to come and teach us today. And Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Well, I want to thank you, Neil, first of all, for bringing me back this year. And secondly, for preempting my first three slides, because I was about to talk about all of the things you just talked about. Um, in a way, you can consider this particular book to be the third in a trilogy, but I didn't set out to write a trilogy. This is kind of like, in retrospect, I'm realizing that they have some relationship to each other. They're all set on the Lower East Side of New York. They're all set in New York City. Let's say that they are all about Jewish organizing Jews, and they're all about crises, I guess you could say, for the Jewish community. Well, I'll talk for something like 25 minutes, maybe a half hour at the maximum, and then I'll be very happy to take any questions you might have. You posing questions has a special urgency because Neil has already threatened to ask me some difficult ones. So the more you ask, the less time he will actually have to embarrass me today. So please ask your questions when the time comes. Let me share the screen. I remember how to do that. Come on, Scott, I knew how to do it. There we are. How did I forget how to do this, Neil? There should be a little thing that says screen share, right? Help me here.
Should be at the bottom of the screen. I think you're still there. I think you're still the co-host.
Oh, share it. I'm sorry. I found it.
You got
it. Here we go. Okay, and you can see the slide now?
No, not yet.
No? Yep. Yes, now?
Now you can. Great.
Okay, great. Okay, well, let's move to the next one. And Neil already told you about the other two books. The Great Kosher Meat War was the first one, and the Chief Rabbi's Funeral was the second. This is the third. It's the story of the entry of the Jewish community into the debate about religion in the public schools, and in particular about Christmas pageants in the public schools. Now, let me start out by saying I'm not a native New Yorker. This book takes place in New York City. I am, in fact, a nice Jewish boy from Newark, New Jersey. But I grew up in the same neighborhood as Philip Roth, but he was a couple of decades ahead of me. Actually, I had this English teacher who was still there after 20 years. And I went to Maple Avenue School in Newark, which at the time, the late 50s, early 60s, was so overwhelmingly Jewish that, and students and teachers, that the Board of Education could barely keep it open on the Jewish high holidays. And here I am at about 8 years of age, I think. I think this was taken in Mrs. Cohen's class, but I confess I can't really remember. What I do remember from Maple Avenue School is reciting the 23rd and actually the 24th Psalms that I learned as a child, King James Version, verbatim. The text was drilled into me by teachers, both Gentile and Jewish teachers. And they didn't have any choice. The state law from 1903 required the daily reading of at least 5 verses from the Old Testament in the public schools. Never mind the fact that in my Hebrew school, they would never have ventured within 100 yards of that Church of England translation. I mean, it is the Hebrew Bible, but the translation was not a Jewish translation. And then that wasn't all. It was followed by the Lord's Prayer. The law also mandated the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, which, if you know anything about it, comes right out of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Nothing Jewish about it. And when we recited it, we were told to fold our hands and bow our heads, even though you would never see a Jewish person pray that way in a synagogue. Well, friends of mine who grew up across the Hudson River and are products of the New York City public school system have actually very different memories. And when I was writing the book, I was polling my friends to see, first of all, if I remembered things correctly and what their experience was. It was different from mine. In New York, nobody remembers reading the Bible in public schools, but some have vague memories of the daily recitation of something called the Regent's Prayer, which was an ostensibly non-denominational appeal to God for blessings. There's only one line. Parenthetically, that prayer was at the heart of the 1962 Supreme Court case, Engel versus Vitale, that banned prayer in public schools nationwide. It was basically the Supreme Court said, what are the New York Board of Regents? What the hell are they doing writing a prayer? This is a real, really it's mixing government and religion in a way that they didn't think was constitutional. And that case was followed the following year by another case that outlawed Bible reading in the school. And I lived through both. So one year we were reading the Bible and we were saying the Lord's Prayer. The next year, all of that was history, and nobody did. I kind of wondered why at the time that they suddenly stopped it. And I think that in a way that had something to do with this, why this subject appealed to me as a book topic. So why the difference between New York and New Jersey? Well, in the course of researching the book, I learned that the states and even individual communities within the states often went their separate ways on the question of what religion was and was not allowed in their public schools. And that you could trace the seeds of these arrangements back to decisions made decades earlier, in most cases, by state legislatures, by governors, by courts, by boards of education, and sometimes just by the school principals themselves. The whole thing was a hodgepodge. In the case of New York, whose Jews had their plea for secularism in the public schools more or less fall on deaf ears, it was due in part to a citywide boycott that the Jewish community organized on the day of the school Christmas pageants in the year 1906. And this little remembered act of what it was essentially civil disobedience is the main subject of the book. The book actually goes on to trace the history of this dispute to the present day, but for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to talk about 1906, and we can get into what happened later in the century if you like in the question and answer. Now, I was the kid, it always bothered me, not only that we were being taught to pray like Christians in the elementary school, but it's always bothered me that Christmas is a legal holiday in the United States. That never computed for me once I learned about the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which essentially said that the government there is no established religion in the United States, despite what a lot of Christian nationalists want to do to change that today. Now, I'm not anti-Christmas. I actually love the songs, and I always love visiting friends with Christmas trees. A lot of Jews, I think, like me, have always had Christmas tree envy. I've never had one. I never will have one, but I sure as hell enjoy them when I see them in other people's houses. So this was nothing against Christmas. It's just that I've never thought that the public schools were an appropriate venue for Christmas celebrations. So when I happened on this event while I was doing the research for the other books, I knew it was something that I wanted to write about. So return with me now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. And we're in 1905 in Brownsville, which is in Brooklyn. Jews from not only from the Lower East Side, but some directly from Europe flocked to this neighborhood in the last decade of the 19th century and then at the beginning of the 20th. And what opened it up was actually the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1888. Once the bridge was built, it was easy to get back and forth between the two boroughs. And a lot of Jews left the Lower East Side for the, I guess, slightly better conditions that they would find in Brooklyn. And in 1905, Brownsville was rather like my neighborhood in Newark, overwhelmingly Jewish. And the book starts out at PS 144, which had just been built the year before. The place was growing, the population was growing so quickly, fed in large part by immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe, that it was actually difficult for the authorities to keep up with building schools. And it was always a case of too many kids chasing too few desks. So this was one of the new schools that opened up. It opened in 1904. And like Brownsville itself, it was majority Jewish. Something like 2,400 students were at PS 144, went up to the 8th grade. And the vast majority were Jewish. The principal, however, was not. He was a man by the name of Frank Harding. He was a Presbyterian, and he believed very deeply in the redemptive power of Jesus Christ and decided that his Savior's message would be beneficial to people who might not have heard it. So at an assembly in mid-December of 1905, when everybody is starting to prepare for the Christmas season, he decides that he's going to talk about Jesus Christ. And he reads from a book called Gems of Wisdom from Bible, Literature, and Proverbs, which is nothing more or less than quotations from Scripture, Old and New Testament. Actually, I did a little research on this book. The author of it, William Shearer, said that he had bent over backwards to find only biblical excerpts that would not be offensive to anybody. Well, he didn't bend over very far backwards, because if you just went through it, you could see a lot of things that really were not very philo-Semitic, let's say. But still in all, this book was not on the official approved list of textbooks for the elementary schools, but it was Bible, so he picked it out, he started reading from it. And then he told the students that he wanted them all to be like Jesus Christ. And the quote was, Christ blesses all but the hypocrites, and hypocrites are people who do not believe in him. He forgives all but those. So, boys and girls, I want you to be like Christ. Well, those remarks did not sit very well with Augusta Herbert, who was 14 years old, a seventh grader. And she was fairly well schooled in her Jewish heritage. She had gone to religious school. Her father was actually fairly active in the Jewish community. And she screwed up her courage and advanced to the front of the auditorium. And she asked, not impolitely, she asked the principal why he thought it was appropriate to preach the Christian religion in a public school. Well, I don't think the principal was expecting that. First of all, he denied that he was preaching. And then he contradicted himself by saying, anybody whom preaching on Christ does not suit may have the pleasure of leaving the room at any time. And then he ordered her back to her seat. Well, Gussie got flack from a few Christian boys on the way home. They called her a Christ killer. They spat in her face. They called her a sheenie, which is a word I never knew until my grandmother taught it to me. And fortunately, it's not one that we hear used anymore. But it was a derogatory thing for a Jew. And Gussie went home and she told Dad about it. And Edward Herbert was an attorney, like I say, active in the Jewish community. And the story enraged him, but it did not surprise him because they'd sort of been expecting something like this. This wasn't the first year that they were that Christmas was being celebrated one way or another in the public schools. And Herbert knew exactly whom to contact about it. He wrote to Albert Lucas. Albert Lucas was a British-born Jew. He was a Sephardic Jew. And he had, when the Orthodox Union, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, which we know today as the Orthodox Union, the people who, among many other things, decide whether things are kosher or not. When that was formed in the very, very late 1890s, Albert Lucas was chosen to be the secretary of the organization. It wasn't his livelihood. He was actually an importer of specialty groceries, but it was his passion. Albert Lucas lived to make the world safe for Jews to be Jews and to practice Judaism. That was his mission. And he was a short guy, but people learned very quickly to take Albert Lucas seriously. He said what was on his mind, and he was extremely articulate. And Albert Lucas had been involved very recently, the last few years, going after the settlement houses. Now, the settlement houses were these organizations, mostly created by Christian missionaries, that opened up in places like the Lower East Side. And their mission was essentially a positive one. They were doing things to help the immigrants acculturate. There were after-school activities for the kids. They could arrange loans for some of the adults. And they basically were do-gooders, but with an asterisk, because on their minds was always the possibility of bringing more souls to Jesus. And you may have heard of Jacob Riis. He was pretty famous. He wrote a groundbreaking book called How the Other Half Lives, which was essentially he was a photojournalist. He took pictures of the horrors of living on the Lower East Side, and he was pushing for social reforms, public parks and facilities that were going to help these people lead better lives. And he was, as far as I could tell from the research, 50% pro-Jewish, 50% anti-Semitic. He really blew hot and cold on Jews. But Jacob Riis had a settlement house that he'd set up with a group of female Christians that later became known as the Jacob Riis Neighborhood Settlement. They named it for him. And he made no bones about the fact that they intended to attract Jewish children and convert them to Christianity. And he believed that the public schools were being and Lucas knew this, and he confronted him in an exchange of letters, and basically Riis set him straight. He said, you can't tell me I'm not that I'm doing anything wrong. You're not educating your own Jewish kids. They don't grow up knowing enough about Judaism. we're going to step in if we see a vacuum. So that's just the way it is. So Lucas was fighting this battle, this rearguard action against the settlement houses. And he began to believe that the public schools were also being used by Christians as a vector for proselytizing. And when Augustus' father told him about what Principal Harding had done and had said in the school, that was the trigger that Lucas had been waiting for. He knew something like this was going to happen. He always warned the kids to be wary of Christmas gifts and things like that. But now he really had them dead to rights. There was proselytizing going on in the public schools. And sure enough, the local Jewish community quickly circulated a petition in Brownsville calling for the dismissal of Principal Harding. And the petition was directed to the local Board of Education in Brooklyn. The way it was operated was there was an overall Board of Education for New York City that was in Manhattan, but there were little boards in charge of various neighborhoods that were under the main Board of Education. And so they appealed to the local board that was in charge of PS 144 and several other schools. And they're the ones that got the petition. The committee that was charged with looking into the issue dragged their heels, but finally they got around to having a hearing, and they actually essentially had a mini trial of Principal Harding. And students testified, and teachers testified, and Harding testified. And they wound up not recommending that he be disciplined. They understood that he had done some things that the community found objectionable, but they said that it may have just been a misunderstanding, that the students hadn't understood him properly, and that they weren't going to take the opinions of students over the opinions of somebody like him. So they recommended that he not be disciplined, but they didn't have the final word because it was bucked up to the full Board of Education, which could overrule it if they wanted to. And so there it went. It's now in Manhattan before the Committee on Elementary Education of the full Board of Education. And it was chaired by a man named Abraham Stern, who was Jewish. And some thought that this was a good omen, that they were going to get a fair hearing before the board because there was a Jew on the committee. Actually, there were two Jews on the committee. The other guy's name was Stern also, but he wasn't a relative of Abraham. But Stern was a different sort of a Jew. He was one of what they called the uptown Jews, whereas most of the people who had signed this petition were the recent emigres from Russia and from Eastern Europe. They were lovingly termed the downtown Jews. And if you know anything about the history of New York Jewry, this was a great divide between the Jewish community. The uptown Jews were mostly German and Sephardic Jews. They had been in America a lot longer. The German Jews actually started out on the Lower East Side too, but by the turn of the century, many of them had moved to Midtown and Uptown. Many of them had become Reform Jews, and many of them had prospered. We're talking the Guggenheims here. We're talking the Bloomingdales here. We're talking Jacob Schiff. Basically, very prominent and very wealthy by this time German Jews, and he was one of them. There was a club that they all belonged to in Midtown called the Harmony Club. Harmony with an IE at the end. It had started out life as the Gesellschaft Harmony, and the official language of the club was German for the first 20 years that it was around. And the reason it had been set up was that the Jews weren't welcome at the Union Club. So they had their own club, the Gesellschaft Harmony, and it was said that the unofficial motto of the Harmony Club was more Polish and less Polish. And it really basically showed kind of how they looked at their brethren on the Lower East Side and now in Brooklyn. The two communities recognized that they were brethren, that they owed each other allegiance, and that they wanted to help each other, but they didn't really understand or like each other very much. The German Jews looked at the Eastern European Jews as bumpkins. These were people who came in who did not necessarily want to acculturate and become American. They wanted to stay in their ghetto. They wanted to speak Yiddish. They didn't. They just weren't particularly interested in becoming Americans, and they were poor and they were unwashed. And for the German Jews, who had by this time achieved a certain amount of acceptance by the Gentile New York, they were threatened by these Lower East Side Jews because they were coming in droves, and they felt that they were threatening their own tenuous acceptance by the Gentiles. The Russians looked at these uptown Jews like they were, uh, as if they were Christians. They would go to a Reformed temple in Midtown, and they would think they were in a church. Men and women sitting together, no kippot, organs, all of this sort of thing. They really didn't think these people were very Jewish. And for people who practice their Judaism 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, these Germans looked like they were wannabes. So no love lost between these communities. And Stern, in particular, he didn't really see much harm in Christmas observances in the public schools. But his committee did record a certain amount of disapproval of what Frank Harding had done in the school. And they recommended that the board censure him or sanction him, I guess just really punish him to a certain extent. It was a slap on the wrist is all they really recommended. And that's what the board did. Now, the truth is that Lucas and company were really wrong in assuming that there was some vast conspiracy on the part of the Board of Education to Christianize these Jewish children. But that didn't mean that there was nothing in the accusation. It didn't mean that there weren't other people that had that very much on their minds. And the proof of it is in an article that appeared in Frank Leslie's Weekly in 1905. Think of Frank Leslie, it was a pictorial that came out every week. Think of it as the 1905 Life magazine. Mostly pictures, but some articles. And this particular article shows a step-by-step how-to guide to indoctrinating non-Christian children into what they called the symbols and joys of Christmas. And the article basically asserted that the joy and the gift-giving of the Christmas season was the best way to improve, and that was the word they used, improve the homes of immigrants. And it was illustrated with full page of photographs of Lower East Side children over the caption, "Benighted children taught to celebrate Christmas." Well, the youngsters were not explicitly identified as Jews in the article, but it was pretty damn clear who the benighted children were, because if they were immigrant Christian children, nobody needed to teach them about Christmas. So it was very clear that this was aimed at the pupils. And it took them through pupils starting out to get the Christmas tree, pupils bringing the tree back into the schoolroom, then sitting around the tree and admiring it and admiring all of the gifts that were underneath it, and then, of course, buying them off with all of the new toys that they were given. And this was essentially proof positive that there were people that really did think that the public schools should be converting the Jewish kids. Although I just think that it wasn't the Board of Education's policy. Well, what the board did not do in the decision about Frank Harding was it didn't address any of the larger issues surrounding religion in the public schools and what was allowed and what wasn't. And this is what was on Albert Lucas's mind. He didn't just take the win when they basically said that Harding had erred and shouldn't do it again. He was after change that was going to make sure that there were no more Frank Hardings in the system. So he raised the issues with the board. He said, what was allowed? Harding had read the Lord's Prayer. Was the Lord's Prayer allowed? He had allowed Christmas trees in the school. Were they allowed? What about images of Jesus and the Madonna? They were displayed in the school. Were they okay? What about Christmas patterns? Were they all right? So the board had addressed none of these because they didn't want to. And Lucas followed up and he made a formal request to the board for some guidelines so that this didn't happen again in 1906 when Christmas came around. And the board agreed that they would hear from the Jewish community before they made any decision, the board committee. And this was the committee. Again, Abraham Stern and Samuel Stern, the two Jews on the committee, 2 Jews and 2 non-Jews on the committee. Lucas assembled a delegation of about 24 prominent Jews to testify before this board committee. And he deliberately included Orthodox and Reform rabbis. Now, as an officer of the Orthodox Union, I can tell you that Lucas was deeply anti-reform. In fact, the Orthodox Union's charter called out the reform movement as something quite evil. But in this particular instance, there wasn't a lot of daylight between what the Orthodox Jews felt and what most of the Reform Jews felt. There were some dissenters among the Reform Jews, but most of them, and as a community, everybody was against this. Everybody was against Christmas in the public schools. So he had various rabbis testify before the board. Each one took a different tack in explaining why Christianity had no place in the public schools and why it was harmful to Jewish children if it was there. And so the Board of Education, of course, was torn. If they abolished Christmas exercises, they would encourage the enmity of the Christians, but if they allowed them, they would enrage the Jews. So despite the fact that Christmas 1906 was now coming up, because this whole thing, the affair had taken most of a year, they did what deliberative bodies throughout history do when they're not sure what to do. They did nothing. And doing nothing meant business as usual at Christmas time in 1906. Essentially, it meant that somebody like Frank Harding would more or less be free to do something close to what he did in 1905. And that wasn't acceptable to Lucas and to the Orthodox. It was kind of the, and when the kids were told that they should dress in their finest clothes on December 24th when they came to school, and that despite requests, the Jewish children would not be excused from the Christmas pageants, that was the last straw. And that morning, articles appeared in the Yiddish newspapers basically telling mothers to keep their kids home on December 24th, which was when the Christmas pageants happened. It was the day before Christmas. What we used to call Christmas vacation when I was little. Now is winter break, but everybody knew why we were breaking at that time. Well, how successful the boycott actually was depended really on which newspaper you read. The New York Times estimated that on the Lower East Side, about a third of the children remained home, something like 20, 25,000 children. But the Yiddish papers, the Wahrheit and the Tageblatt, they reported that many of the schools were largely empty, and that in Brooklyn, the absentee rate was somewhere between 50 and 75%. They definitely made a mark. So there was some debate, even within the Jewish community, as to whether the boycott had in fact been a success. For one thing, some of the schools didn't need boycotting. The principals had essentially gotten the message from the example of Frank Harding, and they either didn't intend to have Christmas celebrations at all, or they had done what they could to take the religion out of it and leave the rest. If you accept that there can be a Christmas celebration that's not terribly religious. But there was debate as to really how successful it had been. But the Jews had made their point. And the action alarmed the Board of Education. And finally, the Committee on Elementary Schools got off its duff and submitted some recommendations to the board, which were something in the nature of a compromise. Really, the Jews won 2 points and lost 2 points. They were very upset about sectarian hymns. And the board ruled that the sectarian hymns would no longer be permitted, which essentially meant Jingle Bells, okay, Little Town of Bethlehem, not okay. You know, if there's a mention of the Savior in it, then you can't do it. But if it's just sort of good feeling for the season, you can. They also won on the point that students would not be asked to write compositions on religious subjects. One of the rabbis who testified before them actually said, my own daughter was asked to write a composition on Christmas. I mean, how is that good? But on the other hand, they lost on some other points. Christmas trees, holly, mistletoe, all fine. Religious imagery would still be fine. They even didn't say that you can't put the Madonna up. They just didn't rule on that. And if it had been left there, I think the Jews would have walked away and declared victory with half of what they were looking for. But it didn't stay there. For one thing, once the action of the board, actually it wasn't once it became clear, once it was announced, it was once Christmas was approaching and the newspapers ran articles that said that because of the action of the board, there would be no more sectarian hymns sung in the schools. It launched a tremendous wave of anti-Semitism. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which was never very never very supportive of this boycott, they ran several letters to the editor. It's an insult to the Christian parents in the city, to their children. It's an insult to the God of Abraham, the Father of our Lord, and the Savior Jesus Christ. Well, I'll give them the Savior Jesus Christ. I'm not going to give them the God of Abraham, but seems to me we had title to that. But hey, um, has it got to the point where all our American institutions have got to fall in line with Jews and Jewish ideas? There was a lot of resentment there. Um, if they don't care to have their children hear Christmas carols in the school, let them keep them home. And it would be more becoming if the Jew would show his appreciation of the favors extended to him and cease from interfering with the religious beliefs and institutions of the majority of the citizens in the country where he has found asylum. What was most appalling about this was the underlying assumptions that Jews were either not true Americans or they were somehow lesser Americans. They were latecomers, and they were merely tolerated by the Christians who somehow had pride of place because they got here early. That Jews should be grateful for the asylum that had been granted to them out of the goodness of Christian hearts, that they should be just happy they weren't in Russia anymore and they shouldn't make waves, and that if anti-Semitism increased as a result of this protest, the Jews would have only themselves to blame. This is familiar to all of us even today, because whenever Jews press for their rights, that comes right back. And not just actually from Christians, sometimes from Jews themselves. We shouldn't have done this. And Albert Lucas got this from Jews. You see, it didn't come, you didn't really get us very much, and all you did was unleash anti-Semitism. So, there was reason to look at this from two different directions. Well, when the Board of Education saw this day after day of letters to the editor spewing all of this, they backtracked. They pretended that they hadn't abolished sectarian hymns after all, which they had. And essentially, they washed their hands of the whole matter, and they more or less dumped it back in the laps of the school principals. It was a real profile in courage. Essentially, it meant that if there was a repeat of the Harding incident, they weren't planning on doing much about it. They didn't want that hot potato, and they just dumped it. And as I say, there were recriminations against Albert Lucas for spearheading an effort that had yielded really such paltry results. But for better or worse, Lucas made the concerns of the local Jews impossible to ignore. And had it not been for his activism, it's doubtful that anybody in authority would have given this issue a second thought. And we might, my friends who were in the New York public school system in the 50s and 60s might still have been have had Christmas pageants and been hearing Bible readings, which they weren't doing. The truth is, banishing Christmas celebrations from the schools entirely, despite the strong legal arguments for this, it was a fool's errand. No matter how much Lucas and company wanted to fight a battle over the law, the outcome was always going to be decided by politics, because there was never going to be much public support for it, and that pretty much guaranteed that the elected officials wouldn't support it. Ridding the public schools of Christian influences was an issue that had always had a better chance in the courts than it did with civil servants, because it involved defending the rights of minorities. And much of that did happen, but it really wasn't until mid-century. I do want to point out one thing about the law. What Principal Harding did was very arguably a violation of the state of New York law constitution. It was a violation of the Articles of Incorporation of New York City, and it was a violation of the rules of the Board of Education. It was not, however, a violation of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, because the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, was essentially written to proscribe federal government power. It was not initially found to be applicable to state governments. That was a process that took a long time, and it was done amendment by amendment as cases went to the Supreme Court, and they retroactively found that, yes, this amendment is applicable to the states. This one is. And the First Amendment, I don't remember the year, I think it was the 1940s, when it was finally found to be applicable to the states. So they weren't breaking federal law, they were just breaking state law and local law when they did this. Well, that's not the end of the story. The book goes on, but it's all I'm going to tell about today because it's time to have some questions and answers. The book goes on to look at how the courts handled the religion in the schools in subsequent years, and how the logical heirs to Lucas's crusade, which are basically the big Jewish organizations, the ADL, the American Jewish Congress, American Jewish Committee, and how they have dealt with Christmas in the schools, how they dealt with it in mid-century, and how they deal with it today, to the point that I'm arguing in the book that they have mostly declined to continue this fight. They've given it up as unwinnable, and they've moved on to more winnable fights because of other threats posed by Christian nationalists. This wasn't one they were going to win, so they're really not fighting it so much anymore. And that's it. So let me stop the share here. I've gone on a little longer than I thought I was going to go, but I will be happy to take questions until you're done asking.
Scott, that was fabulous. I'm very grateful. I do have questions. There's been some activity in the chat, and I want to invite everybody in the classroom here to, you can either post questions in the chat, which I'll present to Scott, or you can simply use the raise hand feature, and I'd be glad to call on people. I'd be glad also to hear some of the experiences of people who grew up in the Northeast, or for that matter, elsewhere, about what your experiences were, if they were germane to this conversation, especially if you're able to keep those stories concise. I want to ask you, Scott, about I have questions about the story from back in the first decade of the 20th century, and then I do want to bring the conversation up to speed, today, to say to ask you about the reverberations of these events today. But let's do the history part first. I really like the way you tell a story. I mean, the book is fabulous, like I've said. So one of the things I was thinking about is there's some interesting characters who are drawn in this story. I'm always kind of looking for, in a story like this, I'm looking for a hero to latch onto.
Oh, that was for me. That was Albert Lucas. I love him.
Well, I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, Lucas, as you present him in the book, is actually kind of a complicated character, and I was wondering if you consider him a hero in this story.
Well, he was a zealot. I mean, zealots always have a positive side and a negative side, and he really cannot. We cannot say that he was terribly successful in this fight. This was a quixotic effort, and uh, and Lucas should have realized that at least halfway into the battle, that he really wasn't going to get much in the way of a win for the Jewish community. But he wasn't going to stop fighting. That's not who he was. So it's like anything else. Our assets are the same as our faults. He was, but I think that he was very deeply devoted. Really wanted to. This was a guy who petitioned Washington because there were no Jewish chaplains in the military. This was a guy who wrote to all the universities in the state of New York, asking them, giving them a calendar so they knew when the high holy days were, so they wouldn't penalize the Jewish kids if they didn't take tests on those days. He really was looking for any way that he could increase the breathing room of the Jewish community in America, so that America was a safe place for Jews to practice their religion. And that I admire, you know?
And there's another figure who kind of disappears from the story. In the early chapters of the book, the catalyst for all this was this little girl named
Yeah.
Gussie Herbert who raised her hand and said, um, this is upsetting and this isn't for me. Um, she seems to be the catalyst that sets these events in motion, and she disappears from the story. Whatever became
Yeah.
of her?
It's not my fault that I don't know what became of her. I found her grandson and he ghosted me. I wanted a picture of her for the book, crying out loud. She was a heroine. He didn't talk to me about it at all. I did some genealogical research on her. I found collateral relatives, but nobody knew all that much about her. I don't even know when she died. I know what her married name was, but I couldn't even find a death record. That's one of the things I always do when I write these books is I try to figure out who the people were. If they have descendants who can tell me stories or who can. When I wrote the kosher meat book, for example, I knew who the female organizers were there, and I found their descendants in every case. There were no photos, but actually, I wound up telling the descendants more about what Bubby did at the turn of the century than they knew. But still, in all, it was fun to do that. But Gussie Herbert, unfortunately, became a question mark for me. I don't really know what became of her. But as is typical with a lot of these stories that I tell, um, these people did not go on necessarily to greater achievements or even to being activists. In the case of the Kosher Meat War, they just sank right back into obscurity. They had emerged from obscurity. They were the right people to fight the battle at the time. and then they disappeared from the record.
So let's talk about that moment in history. Yeah, three books that take place more or less in the same geographical place in Jewish downtown New York. We've got the meat war of 1902, the story of the chief rabbi's funeral, and the Christmas boycott in 1906. What is it about that time and that place in the Jewish community? I asked you, and you alluded to this in the beginning. Can we conceive of these three books as a trilogy? Where's the overlap of these stories, and what does that tell us?
I think the overlap is that this was in a way of coming of age for the Jewish community. That prior to, the large wave of immigration of Russian and Eastern European Jews, who vastly outweighed the Sephardim and the German Jews, as far as numbers were concerned, it started in the late 1880s, the early 1880s. And by the turn of the century, you saw the Jews, they had sufficient numbers in a place like New York, and enough of them had lived here long enough to be able to naturalize and then to be able to vote, that they began to have some power at the ballot box. They really couldn't be ignored. There were there were Jewish voices that emerged here and there in the 19th century about the public schools that which were absolutely religious in the middle of the century. Nobody was there to argue. I mean, the Catholics argued with the Protestants about the Bible. They didn't have the same Bible, but by and large, the Jewish voices were ignored. But by 1902, when the kosher meat war was held, the Jews had actually been vital in electing the mayor. He was a non-Tammany Hall mayor. He wasn't corrupt. He was a cleanup mayor. And he won by a small amount of votes, and he was aware that the Jews had put him over. And he owed them a political debt. And when they asked for an investigation into this riot because they were being blamed for it, he tripped over his feet to give them everything that they wanted. That had never happened before. So you're finding that the Jewish community, they didn't have organization yet. The organization started right after. In fact, I think it was the last month before the Christmas boycott that the first Jewish national organization, I think it was the American Jewish Committee, was formed. And the ADL followed that, and the American Jewish Congress followed that. But at this particular period, whenever the Jews wanted to do something or get something done, they would form an ad hoc committee. But they were just starting to organize as a committee, and they were just beginning to feel their oaths that they had some political power and that if they spoke up, they could potentially get results. And that had not happened before. So, and this was not written as a trilogy. I'm calling it retroactively a trilogy and thinking about it that way. But I think you can think about it that way, that what this was about was a coming of age of sorts.
Um, uh, Listen, again, I'm eager to. I have more questions I'm going to keep putting to you, Scott, but I'm eager to invite people from the gallery to raise their hands and chime in. Um, oh, I see. Stuart Ryan posts a question in the chat that is also something I was thinking about as well. This is a very New York story, and I was wondering if this had either if there were similar things elsewhere or if there were ripple effects elsewhere. So Stuart's question in particular was there anything similar going on in Boston or in other cities in America at this time or
Yeah.
shortly afterwards?
This issue did come up in a lot of other cities. It was nothing quite as organized as a boycott of the public schools that I'm aware of. But the issue was nationwide.
Mhm.
And it wasn't even always Jews that were raising it. Atheists were active here too to try to get religion out of the schools. I didn't say anything specifically about Boston in this case, but Boston was very much a location for the kosher meat boycott because the Boston Jews were affected just like everybody else with the rising prices for kosher meat that they couldn't afford. So there was violence in the street in Boston, just like, and pretty much at the same time, there was violence in the street in New York. But I didn't know anything in particular about Boston on this issue. And maybe if I had dug a little more deeply, I would have found.
Of course, at the turn of the 20th century, the Boston Jewish community was much smaller
Yeah.
Than New York.
Well, everything was smaller. The
Everything
truth
was
is,
smaller,
the New York Jewish community at this point was the largest Jewish community the world had ever seen
right,
anywhere.
right. Um, And in such a short amount of time too, something like 2 million Jews
Yeah,
in the period of less than 30 years coming
right,
from the Pale of Settlement to
right, and
America.
hence the anti-Semitism. Where these people are taking over. They're all over the streets. They're like cockroaches, and hence the alarm of the German Jews. I mean, the numbers were coming in were fabulous until the mid 1920s. That's when they stopped.
So let's push the story forward a little bit into the 20th century and even up to our time. Um, First of all, in your final analysis, the boycott, the walkout of the schools in 1906, success, a failure, something else?
Um, Not quite the success that the kosher meat boycott was, or that the chief rabbi's riot investigation was. This wasn't a shining victory for the Jews. It was a flexing of their muscle, but I would not call it a particular victory because the Board of Education was so lily-livered that they wouldn't even stand up for what they had decided. And things more or less, lurched along the way they were until mid-century. And when by mid-century, a lot of things had changed. And that's really when those two decisions at the Supreme Court changed the whole zeitgeist of what was going on in the schools. Prayer would no longer be allowed. Bible reading would no longer be allowed. But that was nationwide. Uh, but even so, I saw some stuff from the 50s. Um, a few brochures that had been put out. I forget if it was the American Jewish Committee. I think it was the American Jewish Committee. It may have been the ADL. I'm not sure. Guidance to local Jewish communities for what to do about school Christmas pageants. And you compare him to Albert Lucas, who was, basically ready to charge the place down. This was, well, if it happens, try to engage the principal or the board, somebody, it shouldn't go to the Board of Education. It shouldn't be really well publicized. Try to suppress the people that want to appoint themselves spokesperson. Do it quietly, because if it blows up, we don't really have any advice for you on how to put the genie back in the bottle. And that's really what they were saying. So it had gone from being a very aggressive move to something much more muted, almost like walking on eggshells. And then you move to where we are today,
Mhm.
where it's really not even a priority. I think that they've more or less given up on getting Christmas out of the public schools. There's never been a Supreme Court decision specifically about Christmas celebrations in the public schools, but other decisions that they made are fairly clear. And so what you see on the websites of these Jewish organizations, if you look for that particular issue, is here are ways to keep your holiday celebrations legal. If you're going to have a Christmas celebration, do it this or do it that way and stuff. So they're more trying to blunt the evils of it, I think, than they are trying to get rid of it. Now, and they're also not in the forefront of suing schools because of Christmas celebrations, but there are organizations that do that. We talked about them actually this afternoon, you and me, Neil, like the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and they will do that. They will actually go in and sue a school system in name it, Oklahoma or someplace that's doing something like posting the Ten Commandments in the public schools, et cetera. And to their credit, the Jewish organizations will all file amicus briefs. They'll all be friends at the court, but they're not leading the charge. And you can argue that they shouldn't be leading the charge, that this has never been just a Jewish issue, that this is an issue about religion in the public schools, and that there are others who would have the same idea. Actually, what was interesting about 1906, just to go back for just a minute, was the Catholics were more or less on the side of the Jews in this dispute, but for different reasons. The Chinese have this wonderful expression, two people in the same bed dreaming different dreams. And that's really what was going on here. The Jews loved the public schools. They just wanted the religion out of it. The Catholics by this time had given up on the public schools. They found them irredeemably Protestant. And so they had already begun setting up parochial schools so that they could do what they wanted. All the Catholics wanted out of this was money from the government to fund the parochial schools. So it was so they were supportive of the Jews on the one hand, but they really had very different motives.
I think that's a really interesting point too about the different relationships that the
Yeah.
Jews and Catholics had to the public schools, and the public schools were a great gift to Jewish immigrants in the first.
They really were. I think the
That's a
Catholics were
really
really
interesting
glad to
point.
see the Jews sticking it to the Protestants, to tell you the truth.
I'm eager to hear from my friend Amy Cohen.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for this. It was fascinating.
Oh, my
I
pleasure.
don't really have a question as much as an observation. I grew up in the 50s also, and I distinctly remember I grew up in Westchester, so not in New York City, so on the other side of New Jersey. And I remember saying a prayer in school, although I don't think I ever said it. I just sat there quietly because we were allowed to do that. You don't have to say it, but you have to sit there quietly. And I remember when they stopped, but that didn't stop Christmas in the schools.
That's right.
We were singing Christmas carols with, and they weren't just Deck the Halls or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I mean, we were singing songs that talked about Jesus, Silent Night, and all of that. I don't remember a Hanukkah song. And my school system was about a quarter Jewish, public school. And by the time my kids were in public school, I think they drew the line at religious Christmas carols. So Deck the Halls was
Right.
okay,
Right.
but not, Silent Night. So, when you talk about was it a success, it may not have been a success in 1906. Even after the Supreme
Right.
Court's rulings, we still have Christmas in the public schools.
And we do today. One
Right.
of the stories that I did tell when I did one chapter on what was going on in other localities. There was an interchange between a principal and I think it was a kindergarten teacher. And what the principal basically said, if somebody objects, we have to pay attention. But if nobody objects, just keep doing what you're doing. And most of these places didn't have Jews to object. In some of these states. But as far as the religious songs were concerned, I polled all of my elementary school classmates, and I didn't think we had sung any Christmas songs that had any religion in them at all. But I know all the words, and I got them someplace. And one particular classmate of mine, a woman that I've been in touch with since kindergarten, is a black woman, and she said, "Well, then how come I know the words to I have a little dreidel?" She said, "Where the hell did I learn that? I didn't learn it in the Presbyterian church." So clearly we did, and I just didn't remember it.
Yeah, I'm of a later generation, but I grew up in this perverse generation. I'm born in the 1970s, went to school, child of the 70s and the 1980s. And I have a question here that I'm getting to that about your point of the Jewish community stepping back from this debate. So I'm of this perverse generation where school choirs were all in on singing seasonal songs, which
Right.
meant these exquisite Christian compositions of "O Holy Night" and "Hark the Herald Angels Sing"
Right.
and Handel's Messiah. And they
Right.
said, "But don't worry, you Jews, you can also sing 'I Have a Little Dreidel,' and therefore you have a balance because they're this Handel's Messiah and I Have a Little Dreidel balance the scales, right?" You know. So here's my question for you, Scott, and I told you I was going to ask you this question that there's um, it does seem like, and you make the point in the later chapters of your book, that the Jewish community seems to have stepped away from this
Yeah.
battle about uh, completely drawing a line about the presence of religion in public schools and in public spheres. There's a word that doesn't appear in your book anywhere, and that word is Chabad. So Chabad, has staked a claim over the last few decades of enormous menorahs in the public spheres, including on town, town property and town halls and stuff like that. Um, I guess my question is it accurate to say that in recent decades the Jewish attitude has been, well, if you can't beat them, join them? If we can't get
Well,
rid of religion in the public square, we want our religion in the public square too. Is that
I
accurate?
think that I wouldn't say that's the Jewish attitude; it's the Chabad attitude. I deeply object to that. I think that, and I think a lot of the rabbis that testified before the board probably would have felt the same way about that. First of all, there aren't just two religions in the United States, and we did see something in the '70s where the era of Chrismukkah, when everybody said, well, it'd be fine if we can do Christmas carols as long as we do a Hanukkah song, like you were saying. It doesn't solve the problem. There's an establishment clause in the Constitution that says there shouldn't be an established religion in the United States, period. And rather than adding a national menorah to the ellipse behind the White House when Hanukkah happens to the Christmas tree that the president is going to light, I don't think either one of them should be there. I don't think Christmas should be a public holiday. I think people should take it off if they want to, if they want to celebrate. But as far as I'm concerned, it's completely inconsistent with the Constitution. Obviously, I'm not in the majority necessarily on this, and the Supreme Court clearly sees gray where I see black and white. But I think that what Chabad is doing is going in the wrong direction. What's next? I mean, what they, there was a decision. The Supreme Court had a decision about the creche in the public square, which I deeply objected to. But if you're going to put the creche in the public square, then you put the menorah in the public square, and then you have the Islamic crescent, and then what about the Wiccans, and what about the atheists? What do they get to put in the public square? And the elegant solution to this is to keep everybody out of the public square. That religion should be in the homes, it should be in the churches, it should be in the parochial schools, but it shouldn't be in the public space. That seems to me to be what's consistent with what the Constitution says.
I'm with you, but it also sort of seems like I very much am with you, frankly, but it also seems like the established Jewish organizations, the Jewish, civil liberties organizations have said there's bigger fish to fry right now.
Yeah,
there's
right.
bigger civil liberties, First Amendment crises in America right now, and this isn't the one that we're picking up.
And they're not wrong
is that your
about
sense as well?
They're not wrong about that. There are bigger and much more consequential issues right now. And in fact, as I argue at the end of the book, this isn't 1905 and 1906 anymore. Everything's changed. Judaism has changed. There are way more non-practicing Jews that consider themselves Jewish, but they're not particularly religious. Christianity has changed. There are many fewer Christians in the United States percentage-wise, but some of them are much more vocal than they were. Christmas has changed. For most people, it's Santa and Christmas trees and presents. It's not the birth of a savior. And the legal system has changed. We've got these folks in the Supreme Court now who are intent on undoing everything the Warren Court did in the 60s and 70s. Watch for prayer to come back into public schools. I think it's only a matter of time. So it really is a very different situation, I think, than it was before.
Yeah. And I think as we're getting to the wrap up of our program tonight, I think that's one thing, quite frankly, that makes the story that you tell so compelling for this particular moment in history. Not just when civil liberties are under attack from the institutions that are supposed to protect them, but also the story of the surging anti-Semitism that we're experiencing.
And that's a more constant. That's a worse problem right now than whether there's a Christmas celebration in the public schools. There will always be Christmas celebrations in the public schools as long as I'm alive. I don't ever expect to see them go away.
But it's interesting the way the stories are bound up with one another, and you tell that really compelling story in your book. I'm really grateful for it. Anybody else have any burning questions that you want to ask? You can now or forever hold your peace, or at least until the next book and the next time you come back and join us, Scott, because it's really such a pleasure to learn from you.
It's my pleasure.
That just leads me to wrap up and to say thank you. The book is The Great Christmas Boycott of 1906, and I will be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who participated with a link to how to purchase the book and also how to get a 50% discount from the publisher in your purchases of the book. So you can buy several of them. Makes a great Hanukkah gift. Makes a great Christmas gift for the non-Jewish civil libertarian, or for the anti-Semite in your life, I suppose. That was just a joke. Scott, I really, really appreciate your teaching. The book's wonderful, and thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. Great discussion, and kol hakavod. Happy Hanukkah to everybody, one and all, and we'll see you next time. Great. Thanks, everybody. Good night.